Today's case took place in the city of Osaka, the capital of Osaka Prefecture, along the shores of Osaka Bay. A family lived there. The husband, 52-year-old Professor Yasutaka Fujimori, who was also an employee at a pharmaceutical company. The wife, 46-year-old Mitsushiro Fujimori, a homemaker, and their two sons. The elder son, 21-year-old Yoshiro Fujimori, and the younger son, 19 years old, were both college students. The family of four led a stable life. However, one day, the mother and the elder son suddenly disappeared without any explanation. Despite all efforts to locate them, the family received no news about their whereabouts. It wasn't until 5 years later, when a certain object was discovered, that the truth about their disappearance began to unfold. Where did they go, and what happened to them? Let's go back to August 14, 2011, to delve into the details. That day was just another Sunday at Higashi Tennoji Park, located in Toju Ward, Osaka. A horrifying event occurred. The park, which is a 5-minute walk from Hamachi Station in Osaka, isn't particularly large and runs from north to south. Inside, there's a large grassy area, an ideal spot for local residents to relax during their free time. Since the park has no surrounding fence and is open to the public at no charge, anyone can enter or leave the park at any time. Around 7:30 a.m. that day, a sanitation worker was performing his usual cleaning duties at Higashi Tennoji Park. While sweeping, he came across a metal container lying on the ground. Assuming it was discarded trash, he approached with the intention of cleaning it up. However, as he bent down to lift the container, he was startled by its unusually heavy weight. It seemed like something was inside. Upon closer inspection, he noticed that the lid was tightly sealed with tape. Out of curiosity, he peeled off the tape and opened the lid. What he saw was horrifying. As soon as the lid was removed, a foul odor filled the air. Inside was a human skull. Terrified, the sanitation worker quickly dropped the container, stepped back several meters, and tried to regain his composure. He immediately called the police. Within minutes, a large number of officers arrived at the scene, cordoned off Higashi Tennoji Park, and prevented anyone from entering or leaving the area. The crime scene investigation was conducted urgently. The metal container measured approximately 9.4 inches in length, 9.4 inches in width, and 13 inches in height. The container was 8 inches in height with a capacity of about 4.8 gallons. Since 4.8 gallons is equivalent to a traditional Japanese unit of measurement, this case became known as the Wonta case. The metal container had a label from a pharmaceutical company. Inside the container, besides the skull, the police also discovered a portion of an ankle bone. The container's opening was tightly sealed with several layers of vinyl tape, commonly used for pipeline corrosion protection, moisture prevention, and electrical insulation. It appears the perpetrator deliberately sealed the container to prevent the foul odor from escaping. Clearly, this was a homicide. However, with the evidence collected at the scene, especially with only part of the victim's remains, the victim's identity remained a mystery. Meanwhile, the police took a statement from the person who reported the crime. He stated that he was a sanitation worker at Higashi Tennoji Park and performed daily cleaning duties and collected recyclable waste each morning. That morning, when he saw the metal container in the grass, he intended to pick it up and sell it for money. It was only after opening it that he discovered the horrific scene. The sanitation worker also mentioned that there were a few people exercising in the park that morning, but he didn't notice anyone suspicious. Some of the locals questioned confirmed that they had seen the metal container when they arrived at the park for their morning exercise, but they didn't know when it had appeared and hadn't paid much attention to it. To gather more clues, the police searched the surrounding area, using Higashi Tennoji Park as the center of their investigation. Their efforts paid off. At 2 p.m. that same day, on a street not far from the park, they found a second metal container. Compared to the first container, this one appeared older and darker. Inside, it contained several human bone fragments. The following day, some local residents reported to the police that they had discovered a third metal container in a parking lot about 100 meters west of the park. The police quickly arrived at the scene. The container was found to contain several fragments of a human ankle bone. Unlike the first container, the second and third containers were not sealed with tape, but their size and design were identical to the first one. As a result, the police believed that all three containers were likely discarded by the same person. Sometime later, The forensic examination results were. The DNA testing revealed that the bone fragments found in the 3 metal containers belonged to 2 people, a mother and her son. Since only partial remains were recovered, the cause of death could not be determined. The time of death was estimated to be around 2006, approximately 5 years prior. The police then compared the victims' information with the missing persons database in Osaka from recent years. The results confirmed the identities of the 2 victims, 46-year-old Mitsushiro Fujimori and her 21-year-old son, Yoshiro Fujimori. According to the records, the mother and son had gone missing in April 2006, over 5 years ago. Back in May 2006, Professor Yasutaka Fujimori, Mitsushiro's husband, had reported the disappearance of his wife and eldest son to the police. He explained that his wife and son had mysteriously vanished the previous month, and he suspected that they might have run away. The family also had a younger son, and Professor Fujimori didn't want him to grow up without his mother, so he sought the help of the police in investigating their disappearance. Professor Yasutaka and Mitsushiro met and fell in love during their university days. After graduating, with the support of both families, they quickly got married and moved into an apartment in Osaka. After his father passed away, Professor Yasutaka inherited a printing company, providing the family with a stable income. His wife decided to quit her job and stay home to take care of the family after she became pregnant. Later, they had another son. The family of 4 lived a very happy life. However, their happiness was short-lived. Professor Yasutaka's printing company began to suffer losses, eventually leading to bankruptcy. To cover the cost of living, he was forced to look for a job. He was later hired as a department manager at a pharmaceutical company. Although the income was stable, it was nowhere near the lucrative days of his previous company. Gradually, his wife started complaining about his meager income, which was not enough to cover the family's expenses. The couple frequently argued about money. During one heated argument, Mitsushiro loudly demanded a divorce and left the house. She believed her husband was incompetent and unable to earn enough to support the family. Initially, Professor Yasutaka thought his wife was just venting her anger. He never imagined that Mitsushiro would actually leave and take their eldest son with her. He had no idea where they had gone and only received a busy signal when he tried calling them. He searched everywhere they might have gone but found no trace of them. Professor Yasutaka suspected that his wife might have had an affair and possibly eloped with her lover. He also mentioned that his wife. After conducting an identification, the police confirmed the identity of the middle-aged man. It was none other than 57-year-old Professor Yasutaka Fujimori, the husband of the victim Mitsushiro and the father of the victim Yoshiro. According to the investigation, Professor Yasutaka Fujimori was currently unemployed and living alone in an apartment near Higashi Tennoji Park. This apartment was directly across from the parking lot where the 3rd metal container was found, separated only by a street. Professor Yasutaka had previously worked at a pharmaceutical company with the same name as the label on the metal container. Based on the evidence and leads gathered, the police identified Professor Yasutaka as the prime suspect in the case. They speculated that due to escalating marital conflicts, Professor Yasutaka killed his wife during an argument. His oldest son witnessed the entire incident, and to eliminate the witness, he ruthlessly killed his son as well. After covering up the crime, Professor Yasutaka went to the police to report his wife and son as missing to mislead the investigation. A month after the incident, the police arrested Professor Yasutaka on charges of disposing of a dead body. When questioned by the police, Professor Yasutaka claimed that he didn't remember anything about discarding the metal containers. He stated that he had quit his job at the pharmaceutical company 2 years ago due to health reasons and had been living off his monthly pension. To save on living expenses, he moved into his current apartment. He mentioned that he often took walks in Higashi Tennoji Park during his free time, describing it as a public park with many people passing by, and said there was nothing suspicious about it. As for the metal containers, he claimed to know nothing about them, insisting that he hadn't seen any such containers since leaving his job. Of course, the police didn't believe Professor Yasutaka's statements raised suspicions that there could be more crucial evidence hidden in his home. Since the 3 metal containers only contained part of the 2 victims' remains, the police immediately searched Professor Yasutaka's apartment. The apartment was located on the 2nd floor of a 5-story building, covering an area of about 215 square feet. It was simply furnished, with the entrance leading to a Jenkin area where shoes are removed before entering the home. To the left was the kitchen, to the right was the bathroom. Further inside were the bedroom and balcony. The police thoroughly searched every corner of the apartment but did not find any additional metal containers. It was discovered that Professor Yasutaka had fallen into gambling around 2003. Despite his wife's repeated attempts to dissuade him, he squandered the family's savings on gambling. He then took out loans from the bank to try and recover his losses but ended up losing everything again. To repay the debts, Professor Yasutaka went to an insurance company to cancel his life insurance policy in hopes of getting some money back. However, when he tried to complete the paperwork, he was shocked to learn that the policy had already been canceled, and the person who had canceled it was none other than his wife. Angry, Professor Yasutaka confronted his wife at home and learned that their eldest son had been expelled from school because they couldn't afford the tuition. Their eldest son was attending a private university where the annual tuition was quite substantial. Since Professor Yasutaka had become addicted to gambling, the family had fallen into financial hardship. In order for their son to continue his education, his wife had secretly canceled his life insurance policy to pay the tuition. Upon learning this, instead of understanding his wife's actions, Professor Yasutaka harshly criticized her for making such a decision without consulting him. The police speculated that during a heated argument, Professor Yasutaka killed his wife. The conflict arose from their son's tuition fees, and in a fit of rage, Professor Yasutaka may have killed his son as well. Fearing that his crime would be discovered, he dismembered their bodies and stuffed them into metal containers. Afterward, he quit his job and moved to his current apartment, believing that after all these years, no one would investigate the matter further. He carelessly discarded the metal containers 3 months after the case was. The police arrested Professor Yasutaka Fujimori once again, this time on charges of murder. He finally admitted to disposing of the metal containers but continued to deny killing his wife and son. Professor Yasutaka claimed that on the evening of April 10, 2006, when he came home from work, the house was completely dark. Normally, by that time, his wife would have dinner prepared and ready for his return. Finding this strange, he turned on the lights and discovered that the door to his eldest son's bedroom was wide open. When he walked in, he was horrified to find his son lying motionless on the bed, covered in blood. On the floor next to the bed was a sledgehammer. Terrified, Professor Yasutaka frantically called out to his wife, but there was no response. He then found her in the bathroom, lying motionless on the floor, already deceased. Upon closer inspection, he noticed that her right hand was clutching a sharp piece of broken glass while her left wrist had a deep cut. Losing both of his loved ones at once devastated Professor Yasutaka. He believed that his wife had killed their son with the sledgehammer and then took her own life with the glass shard, possibly out of despair over their current situation. The police questioned why, 5 years earlier, when he reported their disappearance, Professor Yasutaka hadn't mentioned any of these details and why he had dismembered their bodies and placed them in metal containers. Professor Yasutaka explained that at the time of the incident, his younger son was away on a school trip. He didn't want his younger son to know about the tragedy, so he secretly transported the bodies of his wife and son to his workplace, where he used a power saw to dismember them and placed the remains into 4 metal containers. He then sealed the containers in cardboard boxes with tape and discreetly stored them in the company's warehouse. After everything was done, Professor Yasutaka returned home and lied to his younger son, telling him that his mother had taken his older brother and left. At the time, his younger son fully believed him. 3 years later, Professor Yasutaka's health began to deteriorate, and he decided to quit his job. Before leaving the company, he retrieved the metal containers and brought them back home. Facing financial difficulties, Professor Yasutaka was forced to move into a smaller apartment. His younger son moved out on his own, leaving Professor Yasutaka to live alone in his current apartment. However, the apartment was too small to store the metal containers, so at the end of July that year, he divided the containers into several parts and disposed of them at different locations. He never imagined that everything would be uncovered so quickly. Professor Yasutaka's testimony might sound reasonable, but there are too many suspicious aspects. First, when his wife and eldest son died at home, as a family member, his first reaction should have been to find out the cause of their deaths. However, Professor Yasutaka only thought about hiding the incident from the younger son. This is difficult to understand. Second, Professor Yasutaka claimed he dismembered the bodies of his wife and son. Such an action is incredibly cruel and not something an ordinary person could do. Third, Professor Yasutaka stated that he placed the body parts into four metal containers, but the volume of those containers would not have been sufficient to hold the remains of two adults. Lastly, hiding the metal containers in the company's warehouse was extremely risky. If they had been left there for a long time, they could have easily been discovered by someone else. The police wanted to press further and extract more information from Professor Yasutaka, but from that point on, he refused to say anything, remaining completely silent. He even refused to reveal the location of the fourth metal container. The police then visited the pharmaceutical company where Professor Yasutaka had worked to gather more information. His former colleagues had mixed opinions about him. Some described him as a serious and meticulous worker who was very afraid of making mistakes. He was also sociable with his colleagues, always greeting everyone. Many people had a positive impression of him, and the company's owner, in particular, held him in high regard. In 2006, the owner's daughter died in a car accident. Upon hearing the news, Professor Yasutaka remarked, "If something like that happened to my family, I would never forgive the person responsible." This showed that Professor Yasutaka deeply cared for his family. Moreover, he frequently boasted about his oldest son to his colleagues, saying that his son was an amazing young man. However, some people described Professor Yasutaka as having a short temper, prone to sudden outbursts. He also often mumbled to himself, appearing quite strange and difficult for others to understand. Additionally, Professor Yasutaka was frequently late to work and sometimes even came to the office intoxicated. Initially, a kind colleague asked if he needed help, but Professor Yasutaka lashed out at them. After that, no one dared to approach him, and they kept their distance. In their ongoing investigation, the police approached the warehouse manager of the company to gather more information, but no one recalled ever smelling anything unusual in the warehouse. Since Professor Yasutaka claimed that he had placed the bodies in four metal containers, but the police had only found 3 so far, they suspected that the remaining container might still be hidden in the company's warehouse. The police conducted a thorough search of the warehouse but found nothing. The police then located the apartment in Osaka where Professor Yasutaka and his wife had previously lived. After obtaining the current owner's consent, the police conducted a search of the apartment. Luminol testing revealed a strong luminescent reaction on the floor in one of the bedrooms. Additionally, in the gaps between the floorboards and the baseboards, the police found traces of blood that had been cleaned but not entirely removed. DNA testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Yoshiro, Professor Yasutaka's eldest son. The investigation made significant progress, but the police still needed more evidence to convict Professor Yasutaka. While the police were struggling to gather additional proof, an anonymous woman, whom we'll call A, and who claimed to be a close friend of Mitsushiro, came forward with some crucial information. A stated that before her disappearance, Mitsushiro often confided in her about her husband's gambling addiction. Mitsushiro was deeply distressed and felt helpless. She mentioned that they were running out of money to pay for their eldest son's tuition, but her husband seemed unconcerned, only interested in indulging in his pleasures. Professor Yasutaka frequently hung out at bars, coming home late at night reeking of alcohol. When he returned, he wouldn't even bother to shower, instead passing out, only to go to work drunk the next morning. A also revealed that after Mitsushiro and her eldest son went missing, Professor Yasutaka didn't show any signs of grief or concern, nor did he actively search for them. He continued to go to work as if nothing had happened. I found Professor Yasutaka's indifference extremely strange and considered him to be cold-hearted. Mitsushiro had often complained to her about being abused by her husband. Whenever things didn't go his way, Professor Yasutaka would beat his wife. I believed that it wouldn't be surprising if, in a fit of rage, Professor Yasutaka had killed his wife and son. The police then visited the area around Professor Yasutaka's current residence to gather more information. A pharmacy owner mentioned that he had lived in the neighborhood for decades and had never heard of such a horrifying case. He knew Professor Yasutaka, who had come to his pharmacy to buy medicine. Professor Yasutaka seemed very normal, and the two even had a conversation for a while. He never imagined that Professor Yasutaka could be involved in such a gruesome crime. Another resident stated that Professor Yasutaka lived alone in his apartment, and his younger son rarely visited. As a result, they often saw Professor Yasutaka walking alone in the park. Professor Yasutaka rarely mentioned his wife and children to others, so people didn't know much about his family. The police continued their investigation by questioning Professor Yasutaka's younger son. He described his father as a reserved and quiet person, which meant they didn't often talk to each other. Due to his own busy work schedule, he rarely visited his father. As a result, he had never seen the strange metal containers in the house. Although he had some suspicions about his mother and brother leaving, he didn't look into it further. He felt that his mother always favored his older brother. His father's income was limited, and eventually, they couldn't even afford his brother's tuition. However, his mother still tried to make it work. She even went as far as canceling the insurance policy to get money for his brother. On the other hand, his mother had never treated him as well, so when his father said that his mother had taken his brother and left, he felt a bit sad but didn't dwell on it. He said, "There was a time when I really resented my mother because I felt she had abandoned me." The case garnered significant public attention after being reported in the media. Many people believed that the truth was not as straightforward as it seemed, given the numerous suspicious aspects of the case. Some speculated that the real culprit could be the younger son, who had attracted the least attention. Since his mother always favored his older brother, he had lacked maternal affection from a young age. Over time, this led to feelings of resentment towards his mother and brother. His mother canceling the insurance policy to pay for his brother's tuition only intensified his anger. This may have driven him to plan the murder of his mother and brother. At that time, the school had organized a field trip, which he saw as the perfect opportunity to act. He pretended to sign up for the trip but secretly returned home that day instead of going out. Knowing that his father usually came home late from work, he decided to strike then. He went to a store and bought a sledgehammer. When he got home and saw his brother asleep in bed, he, in a fit of rage, swung the sledgehammer and struck his brother's head. He then went on to kill his mother. After committing the crime, he panicked, discarded the weapon, and fled the scene. That evening, when Professor Yasutaka came home from work and found his wife and son dead, he was overcome with grief and decided to call the police. But just then, he received a call from his younger son. The younger son confessed the entire truth and begged his father to help cover up the crime. Initially, Professor Yasutaka couldn't accept this harsh reality, but after some thought, he agreed to conceal the crime to protect his younger son's future. Under the cover of night, Professor Yasutaka secretly transported the bodies of his wife and son to a deserted area and buried them. He then returned home, cleaned up the crime scene, and instructed his younger son to tell everyone that his mother and brother had run away. A month later, Professor Yasutaka went to the police station to report his wife and son as missing. With the younger son's account, the police did not investigate the matter further. Professor Yasutaka thought everything had been perfectly concealed. However, he never anticipated that the land where he buried his wife and son's bodies would be bought by a real estate company to develop a new project. Fearing that his crime would be exposed, Professor Yasutaka secretly returned to the site, exhumed the bodies, dismembered them, and placed the remains into metal containers. He then took the containers to the company warehouse to hide them. Since the bodies had already decomposed into bones, there was no foul odor, so no one at the company noticed. 3 years later, Professor Yasutaka quit his job and went into hiding. Before leaving the company, he took the metal containers with him. Because his new apartment was too small to store the containers, he decided to dispose of them. After the case was exposed, to protect his younger son, Professor Yasutaka falsely claimed that his wife and eldest son had caused their own deaths. His intent was to take the blame for his son. Some people speculated that, due to his gambling addiction, Professor Yasutaka squandered the family's savings, and his oldest son was expelled from school for not paying tuition. The eldest son, filled with resentment, got into a heated argument with his father. In a fit of rage, Professor Yasutaka struck his son with a sledgehammer. He then threatened his wife not to reveal what had happened. Witnessing her son's death, Professor Yasutaka's wife lost the will to live and took her own life. Later, a group of thieves broke into Professor Yasutaka's home to steal valuables. They noticed the metal containers and assumed they contained valuable items. After taking them, They opened the containers and were horrified to discover human bones inside. Fearing they would be implicated, the thieves discarded the containers near the apartment and quickly fled. This is why witnesses reported seeing 3 men and a woman transporting metal containers in a small truck. When Professor Yasutaka realized the metal containers were missing from his home, he panicked and began searching for them everywhere. Surveillance cameras captured footage of him pacing back and forth in Higashitanoi Park and nearby streets, holding a plastic bag in his hand. The more the police investigated, the more their suspicions toward Professor Yasutaka grew. They arrested him again on charges of murder. Knowing he could no longer hide the truth, Professor Yasutaka admitted to disposing of the metal containers but steadfastly denied killing his wife and son. He hoped that by doing so, he could lessen his sentence. 2 years after the metal containers were discovered, in July 2013, the case went to trial at the Osaka District Court. The defendant, Professor Yasutaka Fujimori, was charged with murder. During the trial, Professor Yasutaka continued to deny all charges. However, the prosecution argued that dismembering the bodies and placing them in metal containers was an abnormal act, one that could only be explained as an attempt to conceal a crime. Although the exact motive for the crime was unclear, the police had found the blood of the victim, Yoshiro, at the crime scene. This evidence indicated that the defendant intended to kill his son. As for the victim, Mizushiro, there was no evidence to suggest she had been attacked before her death, so it was not possible to definitively state whether the defendant intended to kill his wife. Faced with the prosecution's accusations, Professor Yasutaka remained silent. After a lengthy trial, the court delivered its final verdict. Professor Yasutaka Fujimori was found not guilty of murder but was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 28 years in prison. To this day, Professor Yasutaka is still serving his sentence in prison. The apartment where he once lived has been renovated and put up for sale. The dark shadow of the Fujii family's horrifying case still lingers. The 28-year prison sentence handed down to Professor Yasutaka seems insufficient to quell the public's outrage. The questions of who the real culprit was and what the true motive behind the crime remains unanswered. Was Professor Yasutaka taking the blame for his son, or was he the one who committed the crime against the 2 people closest to him? After much speculation, the truth finally came to light through the conscience of the real culprit, the younger son. After graduating from college, he moved to a different city and cut off contact with family and friends. But many years later, an anonymous letter was sent to the Osaka police station along with a USB drive. The sender was none other than the younger son. The USB contained a video of Professor Yasutaka confessing to his crimes. He admitted to killing his wife and son while intoxicated, then staging the scene to frame his younger son. He begged his younger son for forgiveness and expressed a desire to see him one last time before he died. After 3 years of inner turmoil, the younger son decided to reveal the truth. He returned to Osaka, confronted his past, and chose to forgive his father. The case of the Fujimori family finally came to a close, but the aftermath continues to haunt those involved. The truth has been uncovered, yet the pain and loss remain, serving as a reminder of family tragedy and the dark corners of the human soul. Today's video ends here. If you found it interesting, please support the channel by giving it a like and leaving a comment below. Thank you, and see you in the next video.